Hi, everyone. As Kelly said, I'm Meghan Angelia. I'm a wetlands biologist here at the Coastal Resources Division. Before starting in this position, I was a Georgia Sea Grant State Fellow placed here at CRD, and today I will be talking about my main focus during my fellowship, the Georgia Flood Literacy Project, and some of the resources that resulted from it. So I'll begin with a little bit of background, some of the motivation that really drove the start of this project. Terms related to flood hazards have been used inconsistently by professionals and the general public. Some terms are used as synonyms when they refer to different concepts, an example being astronomical tide versus tide. Some terms are not scientifically defined and have taken on several meanings. These words have become slang terms in our society, and a couple of examples are king tide and nuisance flooding. So in the bottom right-hand corner here, I have a screenshot of an article titled "The King Tide Conundrum" by Roman Rivera and Ellis. And this article explains the various definitions and frequencies of occurrences that the term king tide has come to assume, and how these definitions exist under one initiative called the King Tides Project. So ultimately, if we don't have a consistent definition for this term, king tide, we won't be able to effectively communicate the effects of these extreme high tide flooding events. Still, other terms like spring tide and 100-year flood mean something different than what they may seem. So spring tides typically occur twice per month in every season, not just the spring, and 100-year flood is a synonym of a 1% annual chance flood, which is an event that has a 1 in 100 chance of occurring in any given year. So it's not something that just happens once every 100 years. Inconsistent terminology could cause confusion when faced with threats to safety, health, and the environment. A vast majority of professionals communicate to the public, so it's crucial that these professionals are on the same page with how we're communicating and that they are presenting information in a clear, easy to understand, and engaging way. This is important to note because flood risk perspective and knowledge can influence flood risk decision making. Because there is a lack of flood hazard education and consistent communication, it's critical that professionals from various sectors of the field work together to establish a common flood lexicon or terminology. The Georgia Flood Literacy Project is an effort under the Georgia Coastal Management Program to unite these professionals from various sectors of the field to see what flood terms are used and how they're being used. A major aspect of this project was establishing a flood literacy task force and meeting with them regularly. These 30 members are from emergency management, academia, non-governmental organizations, state and federal agencies, the media, and local governments. Although their work has parallel focuses, a lot of these professionals don't typically interact with one another, and being a part of this task force was a source of education for myself and these other professionals as we were continuously learning from each other, and it really highlighted the power of perspective, because we were able to think about these different concepts in ways that we initially wouldn't. One of the major goals of this group was to work toward consistent, clear, widely applicable, and scientifically accurate definitions of flood terminology. The project involved the implementation of research through these task force discussions, as well as things like agency resources, scientific articles, and results from professional and public surveys to see the various ways in which these terms are being defined and what details were especially important to include in flood term definitions. Early in the project, we developed a stakeholder survey to understand what term conflicts may exist, how professionals communicate with various audiences, what flood terms are used for various concepts, and how to present results of the project to stakeholders and the public. We had 49 online responses, and we used these survey results to guide discussions about the term definitions. So questions on this survey included, do you use the terms tide and astronomical tide interchangeably? How do you distribute your climate, weather, and flood response information? And what do you refer to the concept of flooding resulting from tides, like the event that's going on in the middle here? We received 336 online and in-person responses to our public engagement survey. This survey was developed to understand public perspective on confusing terms, their level of concern with coastal hazards, and the best ways that we can distribute information. Questions on this survey included, have you seen increased flooding events over the last 10 years in your community? What is your level of concern with coastal storms and flooding in your community? Do you know what flood zone you live in? And how can professionals distribute information? So this was really our first step in gauging the public's understanding and concern about flooding on the coast and communicating about it in general. So we compiled all of this information to use in developing 2 versions of a glossary of flood terms, one for professionals and one for the public. These documents are nearly identical, but the public's document includes definitions that can be broken down a bit further if technical details were included. It is made up of over 70 flood term definitions, and we used call-out boxes if there were any extra details or something that was specific to the Georgia coast that could help explain the concept a little more. So ArcGIS's Storymap platform is a way to digitally tell stories through interactive maps and other engaging features. The Georgia Flood Literacy Storymap provides a visually appealing resource for professionals to use and for local governments and the public to learn about project results and flood hazard communication. I'm going to, oh good, it's already up. So this is what you see when you navigate to the Storymap. Is my mouse up there? Okay, good. Perfect. Okay, so we have this taskbar where you can navigate to the various sections of the page. I'll go back up here to the beginning. So the story map begins with this general background information that explains the motivation of the project, how it got started, and explains how the task force was central to the project's success. So I'm going to quickly scroll through this and land here at the surveys section. We'll begin with the stakeholder survey. I just wanted to show you some of the visual plots that were created to really display these results. So here we have a map of where these 49 respondents were located. As you can see, most were in the southeast, but we also had responses from people in Puerto Rico, the Florida Keys, and the Midwest. This shows who these 49 people were affiliated with, so you can see we had a diverse group. Most of our stakeholders that took this survey have a role in regularly communicating to the general public and local government. And these are just some more examples of the questions that were presented on this survey. And now we get into the public engagement survey, another map that's similar, this one more like a heat map that shows that most of the responses were from the Georgia coast. 154 respondents took this survey in person at the 28th Annual Blessing of the Fleet in Brunswick, Georgia, and 182 took the survey online, and they received the survey link through a couple of different email distribution lists. This is a word cloud that shows the most confusing terms. So the larger the word appears, the more times it was indicated to be confusing by these survey respondents. Most have a moderate concern of coastal storms and flooding in their community. Most know what flood zone they live in. And this just gives us an idea of where members of the public are getting their information from. Okay, now we come to this common flood terms section, and this is the bulk of the page. This is where most of our information is and where we present many of the meanings of these terms that can be found in our glossary. It's divided into 5 subsections. So we have general flood terms, tidal flooding, hurricane and storm-induced flooding, flood topography, and flooding and infrastructure. Oh no, I lost my mouse again. Oh no. Okay. So we begin with some of these general flood terms, make a connection to coastal resilience, and define that as well. Second subsection being tidal flooding terms. One of our main topics of conversation, this idea of high tide flooding. So some of the results of our conversations with the task force and what we do and don't recommend. We have a NOAA animation here that shows the difference between spring tides and neap tides. And for more details, we included definitions for perigean and proxygean spring tides. So king tide was something that I definitely wanted to bring up, and we felt that it was very important for it to have its own section. We have how we define it in the glossary. We kept it very general and made sure to have this bolded statement that says that the Flood Literacy Task Force does not recommend this term for use because it is not scientifically defined and it has taken on several additional informal meanings. So because this term causes confusion, we wanted to point people in the direction of what they could use instead to explain these extreme high tide events. We linked the article here and really tried to emphasize the importance of avoiding these confusing terms. Then we have astronomical tide versus tide. And then we put this graphic that shows a datum for Fort Pulaski. So we have these different aspects of the figure here and define them on the left side. Hurricane and storm-induced flooding, begin with the difference between flood warning and flood watch, something that the public often sees come across their weather app or whatever method of getting their information that they choose. We have some infographics that show storm surge before we get into the flood topography. And I'm going to quickly scroll to a couple of our interactive portions of the map. Okay, so we have one interactive portion that focuses on flood zones, but I'm going to show you the one that has to do with sea level rise. So over here we have a sea level rise viewer, and if you type in Brunswick, I'm not typing. Oh, it says error. Okay, I'm going to explain it then. So when you type in Brunswick, you get you can zoom in and zoom out to see the Georgia coast. You use this bar on the side that is titled mean high or high water, and you can move the bar up and down to see the different levels of potential sea level rise to see how what this would look like for the coast. There's also icons on the map that are associated with different landmarks, one being the Georgia Sea Turtle Center. So what these different levels could mean for some familiar places. Okay, and then we end with flooding and infrastructure, having some of those terms and applying it to a real-life situation with this house. Okay, and then here's the significance and application section. This is where we really wanted to explain the importance of the project, why it was significant, but also apply a lot of these concepts in real-life situations. So a lot of it is connecting effective communication to resilient coastal communities. We have this moving picture in the back that shows a familiar business that is impacted by these extreme high tide flooding events. We link the glossary of common flood terms. And then this infographic was developed by some of our partners from UGA, Marine Extension, and Georgia Sea Grant. It uses a lot of the terms that are found in our glossary, such as storm surge and mean sea level, and applies them to a situation that many of our audience might be familiar with. So as we get more available information or different resources, we plan to continue adding to the Storymap, especially under the significance and application section. The Storymap ends with some resources where we have the glossary of flood terms, the Georgia DNR Flood Literacy Project page, another Storymap that focuses on green defense by the Georgia Coastal Management Program, and our website. So let's see if I can go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so as you saw, our final messaging includes a variety of media sources. So what I mean by this is we tried to use different methods of communicating. So we have text, photos, videos, infographics, flowcharts. We tried to touch on a little bit of everything because we recognize that people learn in different ways, and we really wanted to capture people's attention in an engaging way. So this is an example of one of the flow charts that we developed for tidal flooding communication. You can see that as a task force, we concluded that king tide flooding, nuisance flooding, shallow coastal flooding, sunny day flooding, and blue sky flooding were not recommended because of how they might cause confusion, and that high tide flooding is the most informative and clear way to explain the events. During specific astronomical phases, more detailed terms like spring tide flooding, perigean spring tide flooding, and proxygean spring tide flooding can also be used. This is one of our infographics that was developed for our final messaging. It focuses on storm surge and visually shows the difference between storm surge and storm tide. During a public event, we conducted some video interviews to engage with the public to see what their experience was with storm surge on the coast, and we wanted to see how they would define certain flood terms. We also worked with the UGA Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant on their Faces of Resiliency Coastal Incentive Grant project. This project's goal was to create a series of videos that had different resiliency topics, and one of these was flood literacy with a storm surge focus. This video expressed the meaning of storm surge and why consistent terminology is important for action in the time of flooding, and it used some of the video interviews that we conducted. So when this Faces of Resiliency video is released, we plan to insert it into the Storymap, probably in that significance and application section. Some challenges that we saw and continue to see I'll start with the first two. Getting people to change the way they view or use certain terms, and continuing to push or maintaining the use of the agreed upon implementation of the project. So change is difficult. We're always going to have someone or some people that disagree with something, and still there are other people who understand the importance of getting on the same page and kind of provided support on these agreed upon implementation of the project. But when it comes to professional meetings or events or real life situations, it seems that they might revert to an old way, something that we might not recommend. And lastly, attaining feedback from current members of the media was a challenge because they were not allowed to report on anything that they may think they may not be able to take part in something that they thought they would report on in the future. However, we were lucky to have a retired journalist sit on the task force to represent this group. Although we've had some challenges, we have several successes to note. Through this project, we were able to unite professionals from diverse backgrounds so that our messaging is consistent. We did not want the conversation to end at the end of the project, so many of these task force members still take part in the coastal hazards community of practice. A member of the task force from the National Weather Service included this note in one of his alerts that was widely distributed. Please don't call them king tides. They are more properly known as spring tides. The Coastal Empire Resilience Network, or CERN, is a current CIG initiative that encourages and supports the agreed upon implementation of this project. The Glossary and Storymap links have been distributed to many of our stakeholders across the Southeast, and the Gulf States coastal programs have even shown excitement and interest in seeing these resources. A member of the Urbana-Perry Neighborhood Planning Unit saw my presentation at the Georgia Climate Conference and was interested in bringing this information to members of her community. So we were able to give a presentation and engage with members of the public where we focused on the importance of flood hazard education, consistent communication, and also gave them tips to how they could work toward flooding resilience. And lastly, a member of the task force from GEMA encouraged me to submit a description of the project as well as resource links to one of FEMA's programs outreach, monthly outreach newsletters called the Resilient Nation Roundup. It's so important that we continue to spread the word through presentations, conferences, and local events to reach these various groups of professionals and members of the public. One way to spread the word is to post signage or provide brochures in public places. As you can see in the top right corner here, Tybee Island has this storm surge sign that puts hurricane flooding into perspective and can leave an impact on their tourists and residents. Spreading the word can be accomplished by practicing what we preach, avoiding slang terms, and encouraging consistent and accurate flood communication through education. A great way to spread the word is to distribute these links, these resource links, the Storymap link, the Glossary links, and we have a lot of downloadable resources that are easily shared. So if you know of anyone who might be interested or might benefit from this information, we encourage you to continue to share them. So before I conclude, I would like to acknowledge a few people, starting with Jennifer Klein for her guidance through this project and during my time as a fellow, for UGA and Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant, who I was affiliated with during my fellowship, to Colby Peffer, CRD's GIS specialist, who helped in creating the Storymap, And finally, Tyler Jones, CRD's communications specialist, for his help in creating some of the infographics. And thank you to all of you who attended today for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
It looked like for the top information for the public, the mobile app, weather apps were a really big resource. So has there been like a future goal or plan to kind of reach out to those specifically and get them to be on the same page?
So we did have a few members from the National Weather Service, both from Charleston and Jacksonville, sit on our task force. So they were involved in a lot of these conversations and had direct access to a lot of these resources and the results. So we encourage all of our task force members to spread that around. And I think having those stakeholders a part of the group can be the first thing to put that into action.
So thank you for a great project and a great presentation. Charleston was part of the group, right? So we've all heard King Tide for maybe the past 5 to 10 years at the most. I'm assuming that King Tide started in the Charleston area from their sunny day flooding that goes on over there. But I understand why King Tide was chosen in lieu of Proxy or whatever. I mean, we can't really expect to get the public to those scientific terms. So was there discussion about maybe defining King Tide so that, because the public hears King Tide and king is something big, so obviously this is a big tide. It's easy to understand from that. Was there discussion about trying to better define what a king tide was and then use it?
So this was probably one of our biggest challenges, and it still is, King Tide. Under that King Tides project, I think it actually originates from Australia, and it was somehow adopted here as well. But it's very big in the Charleston area. We did define King Tide in our glossary. This is one of the only terms that we don't recommend that was defined, and we kept the term very general. If I can go back to the story map. We kept it general to not include a lot of details, make it widely applicable, but also indicate that it was confusing. So we have that bolded statement in the glossary as well. So yes, we do define it, and we made an effort to make it as general as possible, because these different definitions, like most people define a king tide as higher than normal tides, but then all these details make it so different. So we thought it was important to include because of what you were saying. They hear these terms like, how do we just jump and not include it at all? So we thought that was the best approach, to keep it general. And I can try to scroll back up to it. Oh, perfect. Yeah, so king tide, the highest astronomical tides of the year that occur during a new or full moon and a perigee or proxy. These are italics. It connects back to other things in here.
Anyone else? All right, well, thank you so much, Megan.